for, give it an example, give it another example, it's going to do all of the things that you ask it to do. But when you're now asking it to do that 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, there's going to be a couple of times where it doesn't do everything that you want it to do. And that's where the post evals come into play, because we can then ask it to check its work and ask it only one thing at a time. Does this output make a prediction when the event has not actually happened? And, then that can pass or fail. And because it's a much more directed question, the likelihood of it being accurate on that response is high. And also because every time you do an eval, you're reducing the percentage chance of hallucination by another factor. So the more times you do evals, the lower hallucination is able to make it through the entire process. The lower the chance the hallucination can make it through the entire process.
This is Deployed, the AI product podcast, and I'm your host, Ian Cairns, co-founder and CEO of FreePlay.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Deployed. I'm excited today to hear from Sara Beykpour, who is the CEO and co-founder of Particle. Particle is a new news app that shipped last week. If you want to check it out while you're listening to this, it's particle.news. But they've been building this for a couple of years now. It is one of the coolest consumer apps that I've seen in terms of making use of generative AI in a creative way that's not just a normal chatbot. Basically, it's a news feed where they summarize news stories from across the web, put them into really great summaries that I've been just impressed by as a user, and then give you the access to the source material so you can go deeper and see all the original stories, know where the stories are coming from. And I've just found it a great way to digest the news quickly. So she's going to talk with us about, how they built it, how they thought about the product, their relationship with publishers, but a lot of details about how they work with LLMs, including how they do evals, how she does prompt engineering, how the team works together to really figure out quality and iterate on the product. So with that, we're going to jump in. Excited for you to hear from Sara. I'm excited to be joined here today by our friend Sara Beykpour, and she's going to share a bunch with us about their news app, Particle, that they launched last week. Sara, I'm going to let you do the intro. Tell us about yourself, what you're working on, and just be good for people that are listening that are new to Particle. Why are we here talking? What's the experience that you bring to this audience?
Awesome. So I'm Sara Beykpour. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Particle. We just launched last week, and we're really excited to bring Particle on iPhone and iPad to the US. And Particle organizes all of the news coverage across many sources, and it brings it to you in an easy to read, summarized, personalized feed so that keeping up with the news is just easy. Because honestly, it's too hard, and it shouldn't be.
Yep. And I've been using it for a while, so I was fortunate to get to work with Sara at a past job. I got in on the beta a while back. Part of why I was excited to have this conversation is I feel like this was the first time that I had seen a consumer app that felt like it was really, just fundamentally being driven by LLMs. And I kind of knew that was happening under the scene or under the hood, but it's not a chatbot. It's just a news app that has great summaries and great content. But, I would love to just kind of hear you talk a little bit more about the idea for people that don't know it yet. They should definitely go check out Particle after this. But, tell us about where it came from. What was the idea for Particle? How did you get to where it is today? And we'll dig in more from there. Love to learn more about how it's built.
Awesome. So my co-founder, Marcel, and I, we kind of started talking about this towards the end of 2022. ChatGPT had just come out. Twitter, our old stomping grounds, had just received a new owner, and we were kind of thinking about what this would mean for news and connecting with what's happening. And there was also this huge new technology that had just come out, and we were starting to think about playing around with ideas, and we were amazed at the time. It was GPT 3.5, which hilariously now you're like, oh my god, GPT 3.5 sucks, but at the time it was. And it's only been a couple of years, but at the time it really blew our minds in terms of expanding what we thought was possible, the kinds of things that we could do at scale. And so we tried to think about how we would apply that to what's happening in the news. we also had been feeling, and I'm sure everyone else feels, frustrated with keeping up with the news. And when you look on social media, which is where a lot of people get their news, the facts are conflated with opinion, and it's really kind of hard to wade through all of that and understand, well, what actually matters. And does this thing that happened that everyone seems to be talking about, like, is that what's really important today, or is that obscuring more important issues that we should actually be focused on? And what Particle tries to do is gather the news coverage across many sources and bring it to you in a personalized feed. But I think an interesting thing that happened back then, early 2023, when ChatGPT was just becoming very popular, and we saw kind of all at the same time push around generative AI for audio, video, for images, Midjourney and Dolly, and all of that happening at the same time, kind of a crazy explosion. There were kind of some immediate consumer use cases for some of the other services. So, with 11 Labs and voice transcription, automated headshots, AI headshots for consumers, like things like that. There was like all sorts of places to play. But with respect to text, beyond chatbots, I mean, chatbots are a big thing, obviously. Um, uh, we weren't necessarily seeing a lot of use cases where AI became part of this workflow for consumers. Pre-computed workflow for consumers. And Particle, I'm sure there are more services and companies that are doing this stuff now. But at the time, I think we were, the idea that we were going to pre-compute a bunch of information for you every day, every hour, every minute.
Yep.
And show you and all the other users this pre-computed summary was interesting. And, we built our entire tech stack around that. Now, we also have a question and answer feature in Particle that allows you to ask a question. So that, feels a little bit more like a chatbot. But, it's interesting to think about how we approached the way we think about generative text and that stack compared to a company that is more focused on that live feedback loop.
Yeah, and it's like I think a lot of other apps have felt early on, especially like you're there to use AI, so to speak, right? And like this one is not that way at all. So for people that like don't know, haven't used the product yet, I'll describe it from my perspective, just as a user, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit more. But I get a news feed that maybe looks like another news app you might be familiar with, but there's like just a story. It's not necessarily from a single publisher. And often, I'll look at it and, Particle will have sourced underlying content from 20, 30, 40 different sources, even shows me a lineup along the political spectrum for political stories. Like, are they to the right or to the left? And kind of where do these sources break down? And they're all cited in the story, but there's like a summary title for the news story. There's 3, 5, 10 bullets to kind of give you the highlight sound bites of what's in the story. And then you can click in and go read the rest. You can also do this Q&A and like ask questions about the story and the AI will respond. But until you get to that QA step, there's nothing that like really tells me as a consumer that I'm like using an AI app. It's just a news summary. And you mentioned, Sarah, that like you're pre-computing some stuff. I'm clearly seeing source material from all over the ecosystem. Like, how does this all come to be? Where are LLMs working under the hood? What are the different places that it's getting used in the app or like not getting used in the app? It's kind of be interesting to hear you take it apart a bit.
Yeah. So, LLMs are being used to generate the summary, the headline, the subheads, and kind of any text that you might really see there in the app, about the content is being generated. But it's also being used where in a couple places you might not expect. We're using it to identify topics so that we can have a sense of like, is this a story about sports? Is this a story about NFL? Is this a story about the 49ers? This is the story about McCaffrey. Like, we are using LLMs actually to do a lot of that topic taxonomy. Another thing that we're using, maybe not the generative part of AI for, but part of the whole modern AI suite, of course, is vector databases, and we're using vector databases to identify the closeness of multiple pieces of content to know that those actually are about the same story, and those need to be clustered together. We are using AI to assist with moderation, which is fun and exciting. And I often think about, when I was working at Twitter. So, fun story, my first job at Twitter when I was just a wee lass was I was a tools engineer on the support team. And so we were writing tools for support agents to help with, user actions, moderation, all that kind of stuff. And keep thinking about how if we had the power of LLMs, when I was working on that stuff back then, how different it would have been. So we use LLMs to help identify problematic questions that are asked and help us decide whether or not we need to take action on them.
We'll save for another day the nature of what makes a problematic question in the context of news stories. I can imagine you get all kinds of stuff. It's that could be its own podcast.
Sure. We're early days right now, so we're just trying to filter out spam and things that are just like egregious.
Yeah,
I think.
gotcha.
Yeah,
I've been using. A lot of my feed are like economic stories and like business stories, and there's a bunch of political stories, right? So I can imagine where you get some colorful things on a generally curated app. Because for people again that haven't used it, the Q&A shows up to other readers, so you can see kind of what's being talked about. Get back into some of the Twitter moderation challenges, but maybe like just focusing on the AI side versus the human side. Like I've actually submitted some feature, feedback over time, like, hey, this is like a weird summary, or something's happened. But what are some of the like interesting, awesome things that you've seen models do, or it's like just blown your mind, like that was really cool, or maybe vice versa, like crazy or problematic things you've seen them do? Like, what have you been having to, I'm just curious what you've learned working with these models so much.
One of the interesting things I think that I've seen it do is that it is able to pull out what seems to be, I think from like a human perspective, pretty sophisticated nuance about a story, and capture that within just a few bullet points. And some of those things are like, cause and effect that it pulls out. So, for example, a company is talking about a layoff. Then there's also a CEO change, but the summary is able to understand that like one did not cause the other. One was already reported to have been happening, prior to, another event. And it can kind of capture a lot of those nuances and cause and effect so that it doesn't get misreported.
And is that like prompt engineering that you're doing, or are the models just intrinsically good enough at that? Have you found some models are better than others? Like, I'm curious, how have you gotten to that kind of nuance?
I think it's a combination of both. I think the models are really good, like amazingly good. And in addition, making sure that we tell it to focus on certain things is helps as well. And then, of course, the eval process, which we can talk about it, making sure that it looks back on all of these things that are like super important, helps ensure the quality as well. One of the things that has been more challenging, there's a few things that have been challenging. One is that like, and I've maybe talked to you about this before, but sometimes the LLM can get tripped up with predictions. So let's say there's a sports game, and it's predicted that Team A will win over Team B, and everyone is writing about how Team A is going to win. Team A is going to win. So you're feeding the LLM all of this content that says Team A is going to win, and so it says Team A won. And how can it not? Because that's what you've told it. But there is a bit of that nuance about the fact that, well, actually today's Monday and the game's on Tuesday, and it hasn't actually done that yet. It can sometimes get tripped up, but we've actually found that, with sufficient evals, those are things that you can correct out after the fact. And we're seeing a lot more accuracy around that since adding in quite a bit of post-evaluation on those things.
That's cool. I mean, while we're on the subject, maybe we can just go there. But you just mentioned two different scenarios, right? I think one was this like cause and effect, relationship in a story. Another one was no chatbot or, LLM, the sports team hasn't won the game that didn't happen yet. Tell us more. Like those are pretty nuanced evals to your use case. How have you all thought about evals? What do those look like in practice? Like, I'd love to just kind of hear how you're coming up with them and how you're running them.
Sure. So I think what we have learned is that if you give the LLM too much instruction, it is more likely to favor some of the instruction and not all of the instruction. So you might tell it, pay attention to nuance. Do not speculate. Do not make assumptions that are not substantiated. But you're telling it to do all these things amongst a sea of other things, and some of these queries can be like 100, 200 lines long.
And then the context is really long on top of that, and you got a lot of content flowing through.
Totally, lots of content flowing through, and so the more you ask it to do, the more likely it is not going to do it all. And I say that when we're talking about things at scale, like, give it an example, give it another example. It's going to do all the things that you ask it to do. But when you're now asking it to do that 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, there's going to be a couple of times where it doesn't do everything that you want it to do. And that's where the post evals come into play, because we can then ask it to check its work and ask it only one thing at a time.
Yeah.
Like, does this output make a prediction when the event has not actually happened? And then that can pass or fail. And because it's a much more directed question, the likelihood of it being accurate on that response is high. And also because every time you do an eval, you're reducing the percentage chance of hallucination by another factor. So the more times you do evals, the lower hallucination is able to make it through the entire process. The lower the chance the hallucination can make it through the entire process.
There might be something about how you're talking about it, or it might be just like implicit in how you're talking about it. But I'm trying to understand, like, so when you say that the way that you're doing evals reduces hallucination, it sounds like what you're saying is you're running these prior to serving a response or any kind of content to the consumer. I assume not, but you kind of have an async app. But tell us more, like, how does that tool chain actually look? Like, you're actually running evals and everything before it gets served, but it's async, so it's possible to do a bunch of evals ahead of time?
That's right. And we are running everything async. And if a step fails, depending on the severity of that step failing, we will restart the whole process and hope to not get a hallucination the next time or an error the next time. We'll just repeat until it's clean. Some evals are not as critical as others. Like, some of them are like, try to keep under 10 words, for example, if you're trying to do, some kind of headline or something in like a digest or something like that. And if it goes 11, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a failure scenario. But we can at least keep track of how often it's doing that, because we can, record how often those evals are failing. For the ones that are super critical, in a critical path, we'll regenerate and start over if it fails.
How often does just pure regeneration work? Like, I'm kind of curious, if it failed the first time, what else have you had to do to get things to improve? Is regeneration often enough, or do you need to like do some other stuff as well?
We tell it, and I don't know if this is like a common practice or not. I will say I am not like fully up to date in what like the best practices are. Like, I went to OpenAI Dev Day with you and like sit through all the talks and try to get up to date. And I'm on Twitter and I read the blog posts and the forums and stuff. But we tell it what it's going to be evaluated on, and that helps as well. So not just like guidance, but we tell it these are the exact things that you will be later evaluated on. So that helps with improving scores. Just being in the instructions, also trying to be as ambiguous as possible as well. So
Yep.
when we, and this is all just like prompt engineering, like I said, I'm not an expert at it, but like when we write the sentences, I try not to leave anything up to interpretation in those sentences. Just be as clear and direct as possible. Try not to have too many clauses, like in a way that like a human would understand, when there's like tone and intonation and all that kind of stuff. And everything that I'm saying to you is probably a long run-on sentence, but like, when you're writing these prompts, like just trying to be like, one sentence has one clear direction and meaning. The next sentence has another clear direction and meaning, and just trying to be deliberate about that stuff.
How often are you using AI to give you feedback on your prompts?
Not as part of the process, but is it like I'll be struggling with a prompt and I'll throw it into ChatGPT and be like, well, what's wrong with this? I'm doing this and here's the output I'm getting. Like, can you fix it? And it'll provide some guidance, which is nice.
No, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people listening are doing prompt engineering or involved in these pipelines. So everybody's tips and tricks are interesting.
We do the desperate stuff that I'm sure everyone else does too. My job depends on this. Like, please get it right.
No animals will be harmed in the completion of this prompt. No, you made this comment that, you're not sure how up to date you are on the best practices. I think you're doing it all day long, which makes you way more up to date than a lot of people, right? And so it's good to know what's working. I am curious too, coming back to it, like you mentioned this eval pipeline, but just giving people a sense of like order of magnitude for an app like this to come together. Take like your summary bullets are great. I will like give you prompts on or props on like the quality of the bullets. You're mentioning like they're good at nuance, but it often feels like a smart person wrote them. They're not just generic rote text. How many different evals go into the checking of, that summary output being good? I guess how many prompts go into that as well? Is it just one? But just like, unless you're willing to tell us about like how it all comes together, I'm sure people are curious to see like in practice, high quality AI output, what gets us there?
Yeah. I mean, Marcel, our co-founder and CTO, would have a much more exact answer here, but it's more than one would think. There's a bunch of pre-processing that goes on. There's the prompt that kind of generates the summary. And then there's a bunch of evals, post-processing. There's a process that we call a reality check, which is a kind of eval, but it is one that, when I think of evals, and this is all new, so we're just all making up the definitions of this stuff as we go along. But like when I think of an eval, it's a much more directed requirement. Like, this needs to be X number of words, or this should not, make an assertion when it should be an implication. Like, they're very directed. But we go through this reality check process that actually makes sure that the summaries are accurate given the source content.
Yeah.
And like, recheck the sources basically. And one of the interesting things that we do, and we actually do this for our evals as well, is we always ask the LLM to provide reasoning. And that way, if something goes awry, you can always go and check to understand its reasoning. And oftentimes I'll learn something that I didn't know, which is like, I might have some doubt about something, and then I go into the reasoning and I'll learn that actually some publisher did report that was in fact the case. And, I didn't know that. So I learned that then. We actually pipe out some of that reasoning into the citations of the bullet point summary. So in Particle, if you tap on any summary,
that's cool.
Yeah, if you tap on any summary, you will see some evidence of the output that checks for correctness, that kind of proves that those claims are correct and points to the source, points to a source that proves that correctness and provides that reasoning. Seeing that reasoning, I think that asking the LLM to provide that reasoning also proves the output.
Yep. That's common wisdom. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And then actually showing that to the user, I think it's not something that I expect someone to look at for every summary. But if you have any doubt, it's a place where you can go to be like, is that right? And then you can see like, oh yeah, it turns out that it is. And here's the link to the source.
I was going to ask you about this earlier. Just you kind of touched on it, but pulling up from the tactics on the eval side and prompt engineering for a second, just getting to what you're talking about with trust. Like this has been a big, whether you're building a B2B product or a consumer product, just getting people to trust your AI product is one of the most existential challenges I think people face. Like you're getting into some practical parts of this, but I'm curious what you've learned from your customers. Like what has the perspective been from people? Are they hung up on this coming from AI? Do they care? Like, you're talking about some stuff that's helping with trust, but I'm just curious, like, what have the reactions been of AI generating all these summaries and the degree to which people do trust it?
So I'll answer that question in kind of like a little bit through time. I think at the beginning, when we started working on Particle, there was perhaps a lot of skepticism. I don't want AI writing my news. Like, what does that even mean? And then you start getting into like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Like, this is a summary. It looks like it was written by a human. It focuses on the content. And I think in some way, AI and trust in AI disappears when it's working. When it's working, you don't have to worry about the trust. You don't have to worry that it's written in AI, written by AI. And I think in the next months and years, the fact that something is written by AI is going to not matter very much. There was that. Did you see that ad that Fiverr put together? That video. Fiverr put together like a promo video about how like nobody cares that you did this with AI. It's really funny.
I watched enough advertising. I need to go find it. Cool.
It was really funny, but I think it also hits on something that's very true, which is like, as long as it reads and sounds well, it's accurate, it's good, and all that stuff, nobody cares if you use AI to do it. I think we will feel more and more of that. And so the fact that it is written in AI will start to disappear. When something does go wrong, though, it's like all of those alarm bells come back to the forefront, and then you begin to question what you can trust and what you can't trust. But that is also the true case for humans, and that is also the case for journalists and publishers. Sometimes retract things and add corrections and all that kind of stuff as well. And I think there will be a level of comfort that will be achieved with like this is right. This is most of the time always right. It's extremely convenient and accurate and all that kind of stuff. And yes, there is some percentage there's some percentage chance of something that's a nuance that is off or misleading or whatever. But you'll look at that in the same way that you'll look at content written by a human, and you look at it in the same way.
And this is where, like, I've talked to several people that have felt this way. There's a tolerance for humans getting things wrong that like users of an application would have, where they just say, oh, of course, right? Of course, journalists get things wrong. We certainly learned that at Twitter before generative AI was a thing, right? But there seems to be like less tolerance on the user side. It's like, oh, the AI got it wrong. Like, do you see a difference in how people react to any kinds of failures, or does it kind of all seem the same in your world?
It's interesting because not only is the tolerance for human failure really high, like tolerance for human failures is so high that someone can like tweet something that's like literally missing the word not, that like completely changes the meaning of the sentence, but everyone gets what you meant. And it's like more or less all the replies like understood the meaning of the tweet, and like maybe one question.
That was a typo versus
right. Exactly. There's this expectation that the computer is perfect, and so you can't assume that like they meant something that they didn't, which is why I think it's so important to make checking those sources as easy as possible. Like, do not make the user work for that. Just offer it up. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do with Particle is like, if you do have a doubt, it should be as absolutely easy as possible to just check. And you'll see most of the time that the AI was right, and because it's gone through, a whole bunch of checking. But in the case that something is wrong, it should just be so easy to verify that. And then you'll just know, like, okay, the article said one thing and this was slightly different. So is what it is.
Yeah. All the citations are right there. It's there. It's like, that's a little different from the journalism problem, which is like, well, at least you can get to the source material. What if, like, on the publisher side, I know you have publisher partners, like, what's their take on what you're doing? Do they think differently than consumers? How do they see you in the ecosystem?
I think, and particularly with the ones that we are working with, I think there's a lot of excitement about um, new modalities in this space and how they might be able to do audience expansion, reach customers that previously that previously would not have gone to their website or to their apps and all that kind of stuff, because we are taking coverage from multiple sources and aggregating that together. So I think that's interesting. I think they're also really interested in how in this tech and how that tech evolves and how it could be used to improve the consumer experience, which is ultimately what Particle is trying to do, right? I think the consumer experience since news has come online has been neglected, and
Sure.
I think as a result of that, combined with all of the algorithms on social media and misinformation and how difficult it is sometimes to just get the information that you're looking for, has just resulted in people being less informed. And I think everyone can agree that a more informed public is an improvement state of society. So I think, for folks who can see that is what we're trying to do, I think there's quite a bit of excitement.
Yeah, the way you're describing it's almost like you're a little bit of external R&D for some publishers. But do you have, like, whatever you can tell us, right? But what's a good partnership look like in your world? Is there that kind of feedback loop? Are you collaborating with publishers? Like, defer to you on what you'd want to say, but I'm sure people are just kind of curious, like, where do you sit in that ecosystem and how do you relate to them?
Sure. And, can't talk about our like individual agreements, but we want to be a collaborative partner in some cases for some of the things that we're thinking about, a design partner in working with publishers and journalists in how we navigate all this tech and going into the future. We believe that quality journalism deserves to thrive, and so we want to partner with publishers and journalists to figure out a way for the future to be beneficial to publishers, journalists, and users, and align all those incentives together. And I think that's, again, something that's been neglected. It was kind of like pick two of those three.
Yep.
When we're thinking about incentives, and we really want to find a way to benefit all three.
Yeah. Well, consider me just personally interested, and I'm sure a lot of people listening will be, right? It's an important topic, and I agree with you. We need a well-informed public, so love what you're doing. For the sake of this audience and this show, like, I could ask you 100 questions. You've been at this for a while now, and I'm sure I've learned a lot. We talked a little bit about evals, but maybe coming back to some of the tactics and lessons learned that everybody listening will be curious about. Can you talk to us just more, whatever's worth sharing, about, how these features come to life? I'm really curious, like, how do you decide, hey, we're going to go build this thing? You even talked about at the beginning a little bit of like getting inspired to build this. You're interested in news, but you saw LLMs, and I'm kind of like, well, which came first? Was it the chicken or the egg? Are you having some moment where you're thinking, this is just the customer problem and we best solve it with LLM? Are you thinking, we've got this cool tech, what can we do with news stories? So maybe curious to start there. Like, how do you think about building a feature in your product that's using AI? And then, I'd love to hear you talk, if we just want to flow right into it, about, how your team collaborates to bring these things to life.
Sure. So I think when we're talking about product development, it's very much customer first, right? And in some cases, the customer of it is the end user. Sometimes there's like a publisher and journalist angle in there. But we're talking about, how does this make sense for the user? And if AI is a way to make that easier, more scalable, more accurate, or whatever, then AI is a tool amongst many other tools in the box to use. And now AI happens to be a very big and powerful tool, but to the extent that anything can be done without AI, it should be, because it's cheaper and in some cases, just the more appropriate tool in the box.
For
It does feel, if I can just pontificate, or if I can just opine for a second, it does feel with, a lot of AI companies and startups and just all the buzz around it. There's some, there are some feelings that are similar to crypto, where it's like, sometimes there's solutions looking for problems.
Right.
And
Well,
I
I'm
think we
asking the
saw,
question, right? Like, how do you think about these dynamics?
right. And I think we saw a lot of that with crypto. And just because you can solve something with AI doesn't mean you should. And so when we think about how we do our products, we ask ourselves, would AI make this better? And in some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't, and that's totally fine. And also there are a lot of like standard programming algorithm techniques that don't require generative AI or modern generative AI that are still, perfectly valid. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, and sometimes it's not. So when we, that's how we think about AI in our process. It's a tool amongst many other tools. In terms of how things come to life, I mean, we have an excellent team of engineers, and we have an awesome designer. Tyler Hansen is the designer that I also worked with on Periscope from back in another lifetime, and he was actually one of the first folks to join us. He was the first actually to join us full time on this journey.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. He I'm very grateful that he could kind of see the statue that this would be when it was still just kind of a lump of clay. So when we develop something, a lot of it is sometimes it's battled out in the like design and product phase, and then it makes its way into a prototype, and then we just iterate it on from there. Sometimes the prototype comes first, and that's okay. Sometimes one of our engineers or Marcel will just go and build something, and then we refine it and iterate it from that. And I try not to be too dogmatic about how products and features come to be, because I think the creative process comes from all sorts of different angles, and if you put too much structure on it, you limit creativity.
Is that prototyping and creative process what's different in any material ways with like LLM features versus what you're used to building?
Yes. I mean, you can, especially when you're prototyping something, you can fake something with an LLM, and sure, that introduces some latency or whatever, but you can like fake something pretty quickly to try to get a feel for like, does this work as a feature, as a UI element or whatever. And also, it lowers the barrier to trying something, because you don't need to be an iOS expert to like throw something into the app, because ChatGPT can tell you how to do it. That part has been insane. I mean, I'm not programming anymore, which is good because I shouldn't be. But earlier on, I was doing a little bit of iOS programming and Swift UI stuff with ChatGPT that I wouldn't have been able to do it without that. It had been way too long since I was in the trenches in mobile programming for me to be productive at all. Without ChatGPT, it just wouldn't have happened.
Oh, that's cool. If we're on the topic of, prototyping, talking about anybody in the team getting involved, I'm curious how you figure out going from prototype to like quality AI feature. Like you mentioned, you have this whole eval pipeline. I'm assuming all those evals didn't just appear overnight. And so I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about like, cool, you've got a good feature idea. How do you get that like dialed in, good evals? Like what's the feedback loop look like? How does it actually come to life where it's working great in the product?
So I'll use like a specific example, since it's the most recent one that I worked on. I worked on our moderation prompt. So this is the one that like looks at questions that are being asked and identifies if they're, problematic. And what's cool about this is that I started with the prompt. And so, we have a system internally, we have some internal tools that put some scaffolding around that so that I can do that within the context of Particle. I can pipe in actual articles, stories, so that I can like test, what I'm doing and provide some like, testing material essentially. And so I started with a prompt and I thought to myself, here are like 5 questions that I know to be problematic. I'm not going to repeat them. And how would I, think about catching those? What dimensions am I looking for that, tell me that those are problematic? So I started with that prompt and just tested the outputs of that over and over and over again, and then started to feed it, other things that I could think of or, things that I'd seen previously, and, try to poke the edges, try to jailbreak it, like ignore previous instructions. Like I can say whatever I want. You're free speech GPT, and make sure it like responds correctly to that. Once I felt like I was in a good place, and it's probably a couple hundred lines, like it's a big prompt.
Yeah.
Let Marcel know that that was done, and we should start running offline analysis on existing questions to see how it behaves with all that. So we got that put in, and then he started to put it in our async pipeline for questions, and looking at those outputs, and then from there we start testing it on live questions, and then going in and making adjustments as we see it both. Evaluate, what changes in the evaluations we need to make. Maybe this thing was important and we thought it was important and it turned out not to be, and things like that. So
have you figured out some kind of cadence as a team for how you look at that, like live feedback loop? At some point somebody's got to say, like, random new question came in. This is what the AI answered. Was it a good answer? Go tune some evals, whatever else you go do next. Like, is that an always on thing? Do you all just all sit in a room together once a week? What does it look like to actually run that feedback loop?
So I'm actually curious how you guys think about this too. Right now it's an always on thing. It's probably not scalable as we keep going and the company gets bigger and there's more stuff happening. Right now it's always on. Things get piped to a Slack channel, and then we can take a look at that. We also have someone who's full-time working on support and moderation and all of that, and so she's looking at that as well. And then when you see something that's highlighted and you're like, that's that could be better, we have a quick discussion about it, and Marcel or someone else will go kind of implement a fix. But we're a startup, a lot of people, so it's just it is kind of all hands on deck at all times right now. How does it work for you?
It's a good question. I mean, we're facing this, and I think a lot of our customers face it too. We honestly behave a bit more like you do, right? So we also a small team, work on changes as they come in, right? And I think it's interesting though, it's got our attention because we probably treat our LLM work somewhat differently from our normal software engineering work, in that, we might plan in a given week which kind of normal software features we're going to go work on. And there's we're tracking a cycle in linear, but then with the LLM prompting, changes that might come up in response to some customer feedback or, whatever we're seeing happen, that's way more likely to happen ad hoc as it comes in. And I think we're seeing a bunch of our customers talk about this too. People are looking for what's the right cadence. I think people have known with more traditional software engineering, cool, we're going to run a sprint. We're going to choose to work on those things and not those other things. And everyone's used to that behavior. And then this can feel lighter weight and faster and more casual to just make prompt engineering changes and try to adjust things as they surface. But it also can be distracting to go spend, an hour or two hacking on some new idea.
Yeah.
We're seeing some hunger in the ecosystem to develop some more practices in this area.
Interesting. I think, you can iterate on a prompt until forever. And it's kind of iterating on something that is more artistic, like an essay or a deck or whatever. And I think a lot of that is where evals actually can come into play to help you, using evals as your acceptance criteria, and having a data set and saying, okay, well, as long as these evals pass 95% of the time for some acceptance criteria, you can stop working on it right now.
Keep going. Yep.
Yeah. But that's not like a baked in part of our process yet. I hope it does become one at some point.
Yeah. That's kind of what with some of the more mature teams that we've been working with, we've seen there's a Friday retro meeting, kind of like a engineering retro that's looking at issues that have shown up in the LLM pipelines. Let's stack rank the frequency of those and, tackle some experiments the next week to go fix them. But I think people are just hungry for like, how do we look at this data and decide what to do with it? Your suggestion about 95% pass rate. Some teams we talked to are just like, well, was it just better than the last version? Who cares if it's 87 or, 89? We'll see what happens. Maybe like parting thoughts, we're running out of time. Like, I'm just curious, like if you've got if you were to share like the most valuable thing that you and your team have learned to do, and maybe you've already said it, you can just reaffirm it if you have, but like, what's the alpha that you'd give to other builders or founders working in this space to help them build better and faster with LLMs?
It's kind of crazy to see how things have changed even in the last 2 years, since you and I started working on what we're working on versus now, and how much more mature the whole ecosystem has evolved into. And 2 years from now, it's going to be completely different as well.
Totally.
I think it is easy to get scared with how quickly things are changing. And so my advice, and the thing that we focus on internally all the time, is really to focus on user value. And user value is agnostic to whether or not AI powered it, or whether or not something else powered it, a traditional algorithm, or whether or not a human powered it. The value is what really matters. And so if you're building something that is solving real user problems, again, AI is just a tool. It's just one of many tools.
Well said. Not going to disagree with that as a product person. It's been great talking with you. Thank you. Everyone that's listening, check out particle.news, see what Sarah and Marcel and team are building. And thanks for coming on. It's great to see you.
Awesome. Good to see you.
All right, that's all we have for today's episode of Deployed, the AI Product Podcast. I'm Ian Cairns, the CEO and co-founder of FreePlay. I hope you enjoyed listening. And if you did, we'd love to hear about it. Your reviews mean a lot. They help other listeners. So give us a like, share, subscribe, wherever you're listening to this. And if something stood out to you in the episode, or if you've got feedback or ideas for a future episode, or if you simply just want to learn more we're up to at FreePlay, shoot me a note. I'm Ian at freeplay.ai. You can also find me on Twitter, @Cairns. Thanks so much for listening.